Hello and welcome to another episode of Ancient Agriculture. In this episode, we'll talk about the history of plums in Sweden. Based on current evidence, the European plum, Prunus domestica, was developed through a hybridization between the cherry plum, Prunus cerasifera, and the sloe, Prunus spinosa. The resulting triploid would have then had a mutation that doubled the chromosome number to create the hexaploid Prunus domestica, a common feature in the history of hybridization and domestication, as wheat and several brassica species that are cultivated and domesticated all have their origins in the same vein. Based on historical evidence, it is most likely that plums were not cultivated in Scandinavia until the arrival of Christianity, when monks brought and planted damson plums in monastic gardens in the Scandinavian countries. The existence of damson plums in Sweden during the Middle Ages has been confirmed by finds of plumstone during archaeological excavations, the ease of which you can propagate the damson plum cultivars by root cuttings was easy, so the cultivation would have also spread outside the monasteries very quickly. Indeed, there are still some remnant plum varieties that are grown on their own roots that linger on to this day within Scandinavian countries. These could be remnants of medieval times. Based on historical records from noble estates, it is likely that the first attempt for a large import of fruited plum cultivars into Sweden probably took place between the 16th and 17th centuries. A researcher named Aronoff made the first attempt to classify plums in Sweden. He published his work in 1866, and a revised edition was made at the turn of the century, in 1901, in combination with another researcher, Dr. Smirnov. The next Swedish pomology was written by Dr. Dahl, who added plums to his second edition in 1943. In 1989, the third pomology manuscript was published by Dr. Nielsen, utilizing another work based on plum classification by Dr. Phil and Dr. Eriksson of 1912. Both works portrayed fruits, specifically 15 plum cultivars, in colored plates. In the paper I'm referencing by Dr. Inger Higmermessen of the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, hopes to classify the heritage collection of Swedish plums to showcase the interesting histories behind them, and here are the results. Let's talk about the history of plum cultivars and cultivation during the 18th and 19th centuries. During the 18th century, small fruit plums on their own roots like damson plums and the cultivar Aliment gulpelen, or ordinary yellow plum in English, were the most commonly grown varieties of plum at this time. During this era, it became very fashionable amongst the Swedish nobility to import fruit trees from nurseries from Germany, as well as various other nearby countries. Due to the slow shipment from location to location, the outcomes of these imports were often hazardous, and the lack of hardiness regarding the nature of these cultivars often led to these varieties dying in the new land they were planted in. A chancellor of Hälsöby Castle, Stockholm, named Gustav Bond, had a written document that showed that 30 different plum varieties were tested. At the end of the testing, 8 cultivars were put into common cultivation: the variety called apricot, the variety called Renclad, the variety called Mirabelle, 3 varieties of egg plum that remain unnamed, and at least 1 local cultivar. Due to the chancellor being the caretaker of these plum trees, after he died, the orchard declined. Combined with a harsh winter in 1772, all the trees went away. Another amateur horticulturist at that time was the Count of Grensholm Castle, Axel Spens. He had 4 plum cultivars that were grafted in 1728, specifically 2 trees of the apricot plum and 2 trees of the sweet white plum. It's commonly assumed that sweet white is a cultivar that's synonymous with Aliment gulpelen, a local cultivar in Sweden. Later editions of the Hungarian prune and red egg plum were also observed. In 1780, P.J. Burgess, the founder of the Burgess Botanic Garden in Stockholm, and a key researcher at the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, gave a speech about fruit gardens in which he mentioned 8 plum cultivars. Amongst them were the greengage, the mirabelle, the yellow egg plum, and the damson plum. During his talk, he mentioned that the imports of plums, specifically in the variety of cultivars, had not increased since the first imports by Gustav Bond, and the assortment remained limited during the first half of the 19th century. During this period, the Damson plum and Ampelin Gopelin still remained the dominant cultivars within Sweden. The larger varieties of plum, such as Rönnklad, Yellow Egg Plum, and others, were only seen in gardens of larger estates. Although we still have the name cultivars today, we cannot be sure that they're identical to the varieties found in the 18th and 19th century, due to a combination of name mix-ups which were common during that time period. Indeed, some of the early plum names were just blue plum, white plum, or egg plum. By 1862, however, fruit gardens for cultivar testing were started by other organizations. The Royal Academy of Swedish Agriculture was developed in Stockholm, and by the turn of the century, it was mentioned by Irnoff and Smirnoff that 125 cultivars had already been tested at that experimental location. The Institute of Agriculture at Antwerp had also begun testing cultivars, 300 in this case. In the 20th century, more breeding and collection of plums occurred. Indeed, official statistics from 1927 showed that the number of plum trees in Sweden, counting trees both in commercial orchards and home gardens, were approximately 1 million in an estimated yearly harvest of 6,000 tons. And this remained stable until the years 1939 to 1942 due to a series of cold winters, which wiped out 32% of the trees. In the 1950s, the number of trees increased to 1.3 million. Several of the ancient local cultivars were still grown on their own roots, and still do so to this day. The cultivar Mallard Palmen is an example of a local cultivar that's been produced commercially for decades. This is because the yield is stable, it's very hardy, and it's easy to propagate. This cultivar was dominant in the 1920s and remained so until the 1940s. In 1932, Dr. Rimmer and Dr. Dahl studied the number of cultivars that are propagated and found that the 10 most propagated cultivars were Victoria, Rönnklad de Owens, de Czar, Jefferson, Rönnklad Vert, Experiment Fetles, Silverkan, Hackman, Rivers Early Prolific, Briganel Violet, Almanent, Gopalen. It remained very similar in 1983, with Rönnklad de Owens, Victoria, Czar, Jefferson, Hackman, and Alman Gopalen remaining in the top 10, with new additions like Kirk's, Opal, Gilbert, and Herman entering into the fray. It also appears that the genetic diversity of plums had declined during this time period. In 1942, for instance, there were 73 commercial cultivars in production. By 1983, however, it was reduced to 28. Around the same time, approximately 30 years following the start of 1923, various pollination experiments were carried out on plums, which resulted in the creation of different cultivars, specifically 3 new cultivars, of which Opal has been the most important. The other cultivars that are created were Herbert and Herman, Herman being the hardiest of the bunch. Other breeding programs were made to develop dwarf cultivars that could be grown on their own roots, without the need of a rootstock. The result of this breeding project was the cultivar Madame and the cultivar Violetta. In 2016, the Swedish National Gene Bank was opened. It was created specifically for the conservation of mandate cultivars of different plants. These would be cultivars bred by Swedish people, and cultivars that are historically grown within Sweden. At present, there's 44 cultivars of dessert household plums on the list, all of which will be listed in different tables on the next image. 21 of these cultivars are historical cultivars that, although have their origin in other parts of the world, have historically been grown within Sweden. 5 of these came from France, 4 from England, 2 from Bohemia, and 2 from the United States. The AR7 cultivars have uncertain origin, but are likely of European stock. The cultivar Extra Early Cherry, however, may have its origins in the United States, as it's the only cultivar belonging to the species Prunus ceracifera. The cultivars Wit Irapum and the cultivar Peach are speculated to have come from the Netherlands and either France or England, respectively. The cultivar Fra Asparacissime which I cannot pronounce for the life of me, is also known better under a local name that I also cannot pronounce. The Swedish language is difficult, but this cultivar is grown on its own roots in the southernmost county in Sweden, where it shares the same role as Aliment Gopalnan. It was initially thought that the cultivar Urquhart was imported to Alnarp in 1873 from André Leroy under the name Jean Hativ, although this turned out to be incorrect. Another group of Swedish plum cultivars were of specimens bred by different breeding groups run by either universities or the Swedish government itself. A cultivar I cannot pronounce originates from stones sown in 1860 by head gardener Lindgren at the experimental field of the Royal Swedish Academy of Agriculture, based in Stockholm. The stones are derived from an open pollinated cross from another cultivar I cannot pronounce. But this experimental cultivar has been grown in Sweden extensively, as well as neighboring countries, due to its medium-sized fruit and the oval, somewhat egg-shaped form of this fruit. Opal was a cultivar bred in Alnarp by crossbreeding Ringklad de Owens with Early Favorite to develop a medium-sized fruit resembling the Tsar, with red-colored skin, with flesh that's yellow, juicy, and sweet and pleasant. It was the best early ripening cultivar available, so it replaced the other early ripening cultivars, such as Bon de Brie, after its introduction in 1948, and to this day is still grown as a home cultivar. Emil was released in 1978 following the death of the plum breeder Emil Johansson, the breeder of Opal. Emil was a result of a crossbreed between Jefferson and Ringklad de Athens. It has a good flavor and a good look to it, and it's a high yield. It ripens 2 weeks after Opal, and does not need to be thinned. The fruits are very dense, weighing around 40 grams in most years. It was also suggested that this cultivar is suitable for organic farming. The next cultivar on our hit list is from Balsgard, and was obtained by crossbreeding the Tsar with Ruth Gesseter. It was one of the cultivars bred to be grown on their own roots while remaining dwarf. It was named after the chief breeder of the Fruit Breeding Institute of Balsgard, Professor Herman Nels Ehrlich. It's a blue plum with yellow-green flesh that's slightly acidic in flavor. It ripens near the end of July or the beginning of August, and it's amongst the most hardy of the Swedish cultivars. The last commercial cultivar talked about in this paper is Jubileum, made by crossbreeding Giant and Yakama together. It's the largest plum listed here, and ripens just before Victoria, and is still recommended as a commercial cultivar to this day. The last table on this paper comprises 10 cultivars, 4 of which are covered in detail here. Aliment Gopalman is considered to be the oldest of the cultivars on the table, and was brought to Sweden during medieval times, under the names White Plum and Egg Plum. It ripens at the end of September, and according to Aronoff, it was once the most common plum in Sweden during the 19th century. Another common cultivar that's been grown for a long time is Hackman, named after a Swedish priest, Gustav Hackman. It remains unknown what the origin is, but it's the largest of these ancient varieties. It's a yellow-green fruit-producing tree, and it's the largest fruit of these ancient varieties. The fruit is a mixture between sweet and slightly acidic. It is grown commonly in Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, and within those regions, it ripens in September. The next one is Skarpli Plumum. It's a local cultivar that made an appearance at the turn of the 18th to 19th century. Based on current folklore, a small farm obtained plum seeds from the United States, planted them, and voila. The fruit is described as being very tasty and prune-like in look and feel. The last cultivar is called Elam. It was a seedling found in a small farm owned by the Lamson family in Straghall. In the 1990s, it was marketed by a local nursery. It is the youngest of these heritage plums. The fruit is rather large, yellow, and has an attractive taste. And that about covers everything. Thank you for watching. Thank you for watching this video. If you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe to me on BitChute for a greater variety of content, 4 videos a week. And thank you to all my subscribers on both platforms. I appreciate it.